So clearly he knew the Torah, right? He knew the law of Moses, right? He knew the commandments, he knew tradition, and he knew religion, but he didn't know Jesus Christ. That's why he says, I'm Jesus who you're persecuting, right? What's up, geeks? It's your guy Q here, aka JGTV, and we are back with another one, guys. And today we are talking about still trauma, but we're focusing on Paul today. So we've already focused on Moses, we've done something on David. Paul has plenty of trauma for us to talk about. It's Paul, right? Let's get right into it. I want to jump right into this one because Paul is someone who is very well known. Most of us probably know who Paul is, right? We got 27 books in the New Testament. About 13 of those epistles are written by Paul. So Paul has written 13 epistles. 14 is debated because we don't necessarily know who the author of Hebrews is, but Paul does show some characteristic traits that he might have written that, but that is not set in stone. So we're going to get into Paul's traumatic life today. So let's just go over a few things that Paul experienced, because Paul is someone who God allowed to write many epistles in the New Testament, but we know that before Paul was Paul, he was Saul, and he was actually crucifying God's church, right? He was going all over, killing Christians left and right, just going into homes, dragging out men and women and taking them to prison. But after Paul's traumatic and mighty conversion, right, after he meets Jesus Christ on the road to Damascus, he converts, right? And then he is called Paul and no longer Saul. So let's look at some traumatic events that has taken place in Paul's life. Before his conversion, Saul, who was Paul, caused and witnessed many stonings of early leaders and members. The first recorded was Stephen's death in Acts chapter 7. Then Saul persecuted the fledgling church. Even though Saul instigated these traumatic events, the secondary trauma can cause some negative emotional pathology, right? So what's secondary trauma, right? Based on the definition we see, it's something that someone can experience secondhand based on hearing a story or witnessing something that happened to another person. So they say that the secondary trauma could be pretty serious here just by Paul witnessing all of those things that have happened. It can cause a lot of emotional pathology, right? Saul also experienced a traumatic conversion to Christ. We know about his meeting with Christ on the road to Damascus. A blinding light made him fall to the ground, and the God of the church he persecuted spoke to him in an audible voice. The incident left him blind for 3 days, Acts chapter 9. Saul became Paul, and the tide of persecution turned towards him. So now instead of him persecuting the church, now he turned to be highly persecuted, and he was persecuted by believers and non-believers. So Paul got it coming from all ends. Paul lived through numerous reoccurring trauma events. He had to flee many cities when he learned about death threats on his life. Antioch and Poseidon, Acts 13. Lyconium, Acts 14. Lystra, Acts 14. Thessalonica, 17. Berea, chapter 17. Corinth, chapter 18. Achaia chapter 18, Caesarea chapter 21, and Jerusalem chapter 23. The community of Lystra stoned him, Acts 14, after healing a demonic girl in Philippi. A mob attacked Paul and Silas, stripped, beat, whipped, and threw them into prison, Acts chapter 16. In Asia, one can hear Paul's desperation when he writes, "We're under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself." 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 8 to 9. In Macedonia, Paul encountered such church conflict that we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, fears within. 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 5. In Damascus, Paul had to crawl out a window in the city wall to be let down in a basket and then run for his life. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 33. Paul went to Caesarea and then to his hometown of Tarshish because of threats against his life. It was during this time in his ministry that he endured his worst hardships. 2 Corinthians is the longest single standing listing of traumatic events Paul lived through, right? So we see where Paul talks about, I've been shipwrecked more than you, I've been stoned more than you, I've been flogged more than you, I've been in prison more than you guys, where he kind of goes on this rampage talking about the things that he's done and he's been through. Not to boast, right? But just so he makes things clear. Every now and then you got to check people. You got to run down your own credentials. And I don't think Paul was doing this to brag at all. But when we see all of these traumatic events in Paul's life, one can easily think like there's no way that God would use Paul. Even in the midst of God using Paul, all of these things are happening. At some point, why did he quit? Like, why would he just keep preaching the gospel and all of these crazy traumatic things are happening to him that could change his personality and ultimately make him something else or someone else? Well, Paul's coping skills were very interesting, right? Because Paul believed in spiritual growth, right? Paul believed in suffering for the gospel, suffering for Jesus Christ. We see these two things combined with Paul when it comes to his coping style, right? We see faithful prayer, right? We see Paul believing in being basically crucified to preaching the message of Jesus Christ, right? Basically having a troubled life, preaching the message of Jesus Christ, right? And we also see Paul believing in spiritual growth in a heavy way. So these are some of Paul's coping style to get through some of the traumatic events that he's experienced. One can easily say, like, how can God continuously use Paul through all of that? But this is why we have to realize that just because we go through things in life and we experience traumatic events doesn't mean that God can't use us, right? Some of us go through horrible things that make us feel like we're dirty, we're unworthy, God will never use us, yet he still chooses us, right? Before Paul was converted to Paul, he was Saul, and he was literally killing God's church. Like I said, going from house to house, dragging men and women out of their house and imprisoning them. Like when Jesus Christ meets him on the road, he says to him, "Why are you persecuting me?" And the funny thing about it is that this is where we see Paul's most religious side, because he says, "Lord, who are you?" So clearly he knew the Torah, right? He knew the law of Moses, right? He knew the commandments, he knew tradition, and he knew religion, but he didn't know Jesus Christ. That's why he says, "I'm Jesus who you're persecuting," right? So I want you guys to really sit back and think about this, because Paul went through so much hardship. And I mean, man, to preach the gospel, it's even worse. I mean, he's getting bitten by snakes. One minute he gets bit by a snake, people think he's cursed. The next minute, because he doesn't die, they think he's like a god or something. And the same thing happens in Greece, where one minute they're preaching and they think they're Greek gods. The next minute they tear their clothes and they're like, "Hey, we're regular men just like you. We're just here to preach the message," and then they want to kill them. So these back and forth traumatic events, I'm surprised Paul himself didn't quit, but Paul had a reverence for Jesus Christ. He truly believed in the gospel, and he preached it with all his heart, all his mind, and all his soul. And we see that because he's written 13 epistles. Like, the Pauline epistles are extremely important. In seminary, I literally took a class that was just on Paul. Like, it was called Studies in Paul, and it was only on Paul. And I mean, man, I learned some really amazing things about Paul in there, but he's really a force to be reckoned with. Like, we got to put some respect on Paul's name, right? Because God allowed 13 epistles to be written by the Apostle Paul, and we can learn a lot from Paul when we see him going through so much as he's preaching the gospel, enduring so much, but he just keeps going. He doesn't quit, and he doesn't let himself talk himself out of what God has called him to do, right? We see him struggling with the thorn in his flesh, and he's begging God to take it away, but the Lord says, my grace is sufficient. And guess what? We don't see Paul stop preaching or spreading the gospel. He keeps going. So I want you guys to be encouraged by that. Be encouraged by Paul. He is a great person to look to in the Bible. God used him in a mighty way, and we can learn a lot from Paul when it comes to someone who faces traumatic events before and after preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Share this video with somebody, and the next trauma video is coming right behind this. I'm not going to reveal who it is, so you got to stay tuned. Take care of yourself, guys. What do I always say? Love yourselves, love one another, but most of all, love God. Peace.